Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session of the Archival Encounters lecture series, a series of talks and conversations that brings together scholars, writers, artists, and cultural creators to discuss the limitations and imaginative possibilities of engaging with colonial archives. Today, I have the pleasure to welcome Deborah Thomas and Nydia Swaby for a discussion on affective archives, witnessing, and repair. The session will begin with a lecture by Deborah Thomas, who will present some of her recent filmic work, drawing on her latest book, Political Life in the Wake of the Plantation, Sovereignty, Witnessing, Repair, in which she pulls from visual, oral, historical, and colonial archives to trace the long-term legacies of the plantation system in Jamaica and in post-plantation societies more broadly. The lecture will be followed by a dialogue with Nydia Swaby, who will also present some of her creative practice in response and relation to Deborah Thomas' work. Before we begin, I will briefly introduce each one of you and then pass on the word to Deborah. Deborah Thomas is the R. Jean Brownlee Professor of Anthropology and the Director of the Center for Experimental Ethnography at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also a research associate with the Visual Identities in Art and Design Research Center at the University of Johannesburg. Her recent book, Political Life in the Wake of the Plantation, was awarded the Senior Book Prize from the American Ethnological Society in 2020, and was also the runner-up for the Gregory Bateson Prize in the same year. She's also the author of Exceptional Violence, Embodied Citizenship in Transnational Jamaica from 2011, and Modern Blackness, Nationalism, Globalization, and the Politics of Culture in Jamaica, and co-editor of the volume Globalization and Race, Transformations in the Cultural Production of Blackness from 2004. Her articles have appeared in a diverse range of journals, including Cultural Anthropology, American Anthropologist, Radical History Review, Anthropological Theory, Small Acts, Identities, Interventions, and Feminist Review. Thomas has also co-directed and co-produced 2 documentary films, Bad Friday, A Safari After Coral Gardens, which chronicles violence in Jamaica through the eyes of its most iconic community, and 4 Days in May, Kingston 2010, which explores the effects of the Tivoli incursion in May 2020. Thomas is also the co-curator of the multimedia installation titled Bearing Witness, 4 Days in West Kingston, which opened at the Penn Museum in November 2017. Thomas edited the journal Transforming Anthropology from 2010, and currently sits on the editorial boards of Social and Economic Studies and Anthropological Theory. From 2016 to 2020, she was the editor-in-chief of American Anthropologist, the flagship journal of the American Anthropological Association. She has served on the executive boards of the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora, the Caribbean Studies Association, and the Society for Cultural Anthropology. Prior to Thomas' life as an academic, she was a professional dancer with the New York-based Urban Bush Women. Nydia Swaby is a Black feminist researcher, writer, and curator based in London. She has a PhD in gender studies, an MA in women's history, and a BA in anthropology and African American studies. Her practice builds on theories of racial, gendered, diasporic, and queer formation, Black feminism, Black studies, and her previous experience working at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. She's a member of Feminist Review's editorial collective and co-edited a recent issue on feminist, queer, and diasporic archives published in July 2020. Her writing has been published in Africana Heritage, Revisionist, Symbolism, and Feminist Review, and she's currently writing a monograph tentatively titled Becoming with the Archive, a research memoir that interweaves personal narrative and family history with research in archives in Jamaica, the United States, and the United Kingdom. She's a curator of learning at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London, where she works with academics, curators, artists, and writers to develop a multidisciplinary practice-based research and learning program. So thank you so much to both of you for taking the time to be with us today. And I hand it over to you, Deborah.
Hey, thank you, Daniela, for organizing this and organizing the whole series, which is a really provocative engagement with interrogation of archives. And thanks also to you, Nydia, for having this discussion. I'm really looking forward to sort of seeing the points in common and the points of divergence in the kinds of things that we're thinking about. So I hope this will be really productive. I am going to start by talking a little bit about the work that I've been doing, the work that forms the basis of the 2019 book, but also the artistic work that I've been doing in collaboration with Junior Wedderburn and Deanne Bell over the last few years. And then I will show you one aspect of that work, a short 7.5-minute experimental nonlinear, non-narrative film. Like many of you who are, in these conversations and interested in these issues, I've been grappling with many similar questions, having to do in particular with the foundation of the modern West and the dismantling of that foundation. So if we understand that the modern West was built on indigenous dispossession and slavery through the development of plantation-based agriculture, and if both indigenous and African-descended populations were excluded from modern notions of personhood, then what could it mean to be human politically in the wake of the West, in the wake of this plantation-based economic, political, and social system? How have people confronted the unpredictable afterlives of colonialism and slavery, nationalism and state formation in ways that perform not only a material transformation, but also an affective one? I've really been interested in the question of what does sovereignty feel like, right? And these kinds of questions have been haunting me over the past many years as I've been developing archives of the relationships between sovereignty and violence in Jamaica. My specific obsessions have had to do with the temporal regimes to which post-colonial sovereignty projects have been tethered, how these have conditioned the affective states through which they're enacted and experienced, and how these have shaped the complex relationships among sovereignty and subjectivity within a context whose foundational infrastructures were imperialism, colonization, and plantation-based slavery. I've been interested in what Sylvia Wynter identified as a constitutive tension between the dominant logic of the plantation and its internal threat, the often millennial spaces in which enslaved persons maintained a conception of themselves as human rather than as property. And it's this tension that would ultimately shape the relationship between the national and the popular in struggles over sovereignty. And it's also this tension that becomes legible by attending both to moments of exceptional violence and to the realm of everyday practice. My mode of attention to these tensions has been a form of bearing witness I've been calling Witnessing 2.0. So Witnessing 2.0 is not the witnessing of human rights organizations or of public tribunals like Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Witnessing 2.0 is instead a quotidian process and practice of watching, listening, and feeling that is relational and profoundly intersubjective. It's a moral practice also that involves exploring our complicity within contemporary events, what Avery Gordon would call responsibility, the ability to make a response, to have a response, to enact a response, right? So Witnessing 2.0 makes visible how affects operate in multiple temporalities and across levels of consciousness. It's a practice of recognition and a practice of love that destabilizes the boundaries between knowing and feeling, complicity and accountability, and one that potentially reformulates the ground of the human itself. By focusing on the extent to which one recognizes the various ways we're implicated in the processes we address, Witnessing 2.0 produces intimacies through the development of affective archives, while it also reveals the ways we maintain the conjunctures of power within which we live. Witnessing 2.0 can therefore ultimately produce the internal shifts in consciousness that radiate from one to another in unexpected and necessarily non-linear ways, and that therefore can lead to lasting world-changing transformations. So the Tivoli Stories Project has been our attempt at Witnessing 2.0. So this is a project that explores in a range of forms the 2010 state of emergency in West Kingston, Jamaica. In May of that year, security forces went into Tivoli Gardens in order to capture Christopher Duras Coke, who had been ordered for extradition to the United States. Officially, 74 civilians were killed during the operation, but the number that community members give is closer to 200. Beginning in 2012, I worked collaboratively with Junior Wedderburn and Deanne Bell on a multimodal project addressing these events. And our process was to assemble a variety of archives, including drone footage, archival footage, still and moving images of the contemporary landscape, still and video portraiture, and narratives from community members who talked about their experiences during the state of emergency. We were interested in how these assemblages could bring into being a range of affective orientations that would themselves be differently apprehended based on one's location. And by location, I mean a political location, a structural location, a national location, but also a kind of psychic location in relation to these archives. Right? So ultimately, we were interested in the forms of recognition that might be possible across these various locations, and in the extent to which visual archives might either generate them or make them unrealizable. We have felt that our multimodal research practices might work to generate new forms of public awareness of and dialogue about the long-term effects and manifestations of political, drug-related, and intercommunal violence. We have also suspected that in environments in which individuals continue to experience the effects of traumatic violence, multimodal representations might allow for different levels of consciousness and awareness about the everyday ways these forms of violence are perpetuated. The Tivoli Stories thus represents our attempt to bring into being a different ethical register, one that really focuses on the quotidian expectations and experiences of social and political personhood within the community of Tivoli Gardens, and one that also creates a different kind of archive than that which is generally publicly available. So to explain what I mean by this, you have to know that Tivoli Gardens has always been what one resident called the, quote, flagship community for the Jamaica Labor Party, the mother of all so-called garrison communities. So what is a garrison community? Garrison communities are territorially rooted, homogeneous voting neighborhoods in downtown Kingston, where political support has been exchanged for contracts and other social welfare benefits, and that these are exchanges mediated through the relationship between an elected politician for the area and the local don, or sort of leader, area leader. And the partisanship of garrison communities has been enduring, but the relationship between elected politicians and community leaders became part of a more general ideological struggle during the 1970s and transformed again as the elaboration of the transnational trades in cocaine and weapons supplanted a previously smaller scale trafficking in ganja. The latter phenomenon strengthened the role of dons vis-a-vis politicians, as dons' increasing involvement in both illicit and legitimate businesses provided politicians with financial support, in addition to the militia-like support offered during election periods. Garrisons, therefore, exist as a primary loci of political corruption, historically and in the present. They also constitute a kind of palimpsest of the plantation. Tivoli Gardens, downtown, garrison, and ghetto mark the slot of Blackness, insofar as Blackness refers to that position that both instantiates and potentially undermines and undoes the liberal order, the position that makes it insecure. To say that geography mediates the experience of racialized abjection connects the question of the value of Black life to the question of security and corruption. So just as some Black lives seem to matter more than others, some ghetto lives do as well. And those who are living in what we call garrison communities often remain outside the realm of public empathy because they're seen to destabilize the security of liberal governance more generally, just as riots and revolts by enslaved persons jeopardize the security of the plantation-based extractive system. Garrison dwellers are therefore not always seen as worthy of protection, and their deaths are not always seen as worthy of mourning. So if we understand the political dynamics of the plantation during the period of slavery as inaugurating a system of patronage and clientelism, albeit an unstable one, in which political authority was not only racialized, but also tied to territorially rooted patterns of protection that ultimately encouraged alliances between the powerful and those they exploited, and that undermined alliances among the exploited themselves, then we see continuities with the systems of political patronage and clientelism that came to characterize partisan politics during the post-colonial period in Jamaica. So what I'm trying to highlight here is that just as the plantation was foundational to modern economic production and labor organization, it was this phenomenon that also shaped the infrastructures, practices, and processes of politics during the post-emancipation period and within post-colonial New World nation states. So to rework these relations requires that we, one, track the long-term entanglements that have produced and sustained the binary structuring our modern world so that we find ways to undo dualistic modalities of thinking and acting by taking seriously embodied ways of knowing and understanding in order to generate meaningful forms of repair. And this is, for me, the work of Witnessing 2.0. So through our multimodal work, we have been able to glean some insights into the themes that emerged through the narratives that we recorded with West Kingston community members. A looping sense of temporality and racial reckoning, a difficult to parse relationship between surveillance and witnessing, a complex chain of multi-scalar political entanglements, a sense of trauma that is social rather than individual, and a profound perception of misrecognition. And here I mean to evoke misrecognition in its most capacious sense, one that incorporates not only the difficulties of self-making, but also the resistance to identifying the geopolitical and psychic infrastructures that have undergirded the modern colonial and nationalist state within Jamaica. In our visual work, we've been able to proximately juxtapose divergent scales, perspectives, and times. We've been able to generate affective engagements through the production and editing decisions we've made. Because these engagements are both unpredictable and aspirational, our multimodal work seeks to accept this kind of indeterminacy while also attempting to awaken some sort of recognition of the domains in which we, as producers and consumers of events and their representations, are complicit. So I can talk more specifically later, if you like, about the kinds of decisions that we made in our editing and filming processes and how these reflect our general approach. But overall, our intention has been not to generate trauma testimonies, but instead to develop a dynamic affective space in which the trauma of exceptional violence is deeply contextualized at many levels of scale, and in which the entanglements among these different levels of scale remain open and unresolved questions rather than pat narratives. This intention also permeates the sound Junior Wedderburn created, both for the documentary and for the installation and for the shorter film. And the sound moves between a kind of sense of enclosure and trepidation and one of potentiality. It was designed to lead viewers through the events without necessarily satisfying a desire for or expectation of affective resolution. And it was designed to support the events without romanticizing them. or to support the narratives, sorry, without romanticizing them. So today, Tivoli Stories has taken a number of forms. An exhibit at the Penn Museum that opened in November 2017, and which we just did a sort of celebration removal ceremony for a couple weeks ago. Also, there's a 40-minute documentary film called 4 Days in May, and a 7.5-minute experimental short. We were due to take it as an art exhibit, so transforming it again into a different kind of shape to the National Gallery of Jamaica in August, but that fell apart not only because of COVID, but also for political reasons, as elections were scheduled to occur right after the period when we were going to open. But Tivoli Stories has shape-shifted in this way, in part because of the kinds of archives we've assembled, but it's also taken this multiplicity of forms as the result of the different audiences that we have sought to engage in different ways and toward different ends. So the 40-minute documentary could speak to a number of audiences outside Jamaica. In the film, mothers describe watching their sons being executed. A brother mourns the killing of a sibling shot execution style next to his stepfather. An aunt talks about having to identify her nephew's body, parts of which had been burned beyond recognition. Other young men describe being taunted by soldiers, made to run while shots were being fired after them, not knowing whether they were going to live or die. And while those concerned with issues related to human rights and or trauma and with global anti-Black state violence are drawn to these aspects of the film, my own feeling has been that its rightful audience is working and middle-class Jamaicans because of what a familiarity with the events and visual landscape could produce. So with this in mind, we've been experimenting with how a series of screenings, we call them guerrilla screenings, moderated public discussions about political and other forms of violence, and community-based ritual interventions addressing social and economic development in Jamaica that might generate, so we've been experimenting to see how these kinds of screenings with discussions might generate alternatives to the policy-driven approaches that normally constitute intervention within the public sphere. So to date, we've screened 4 Days in May in community-based settings in the parishes of Kingston, St. Thomas, and Portland, as well as at the University of the West Indies and the Mona campus. Given the intense political, social, and economic polarizations in Jamaican society, we have screened in spaces where people are already accustomed to coming together across partisan political boundaries. And these screenings have been followed by moderated community discussions during which people have spoken about their own experiences with state violence, about the broader history of violence in Jamaica and the legacies of the Cold War and US intervention. They've spoken about the effects of the transnational trades in drugs and arms, about the psychological trauma influencing contemporary decision-making, and about the impossibility of measuring the long-term effect of states of emergency that result in civilian death, especially for people who were youth at the time of the state of emergency who are now coming into adulthood. And they've talked about the extent to which they feel real transformation of the conditions that allow these processes to occur, the extent to which that kind of transformation is possible. Sometimes, as a result of these discussions, audiences have reevaluated what they thought they knew and what they thought they understood about the events of May 2010. They've rethought their assumptions, both about how political violence operates and about the humanity of people who live in areas where it's rampant. And they've discussed the kinds of accountability the state has or has not been willing to provide, and the kinds of insecurity with which they're constantly confronted. During one post-screening discussion of our film in Kingston, a woman who had been a political representative for the People's National Party during the height of the political turf wars in the 1970s, spoke of being terrorized by the dawn of Tivoli Gardens during that period. She shook with rage and she asked, "What has Tivoli learned from their experiences in 2010? What was amazing was that when she asked this, she was not met with derision, right? The Tivoli Gardens community residents who were also at the screening did not attempt to shout her down. Instead, the woman who identified her nephew's burned body said, "There are good and bad within Tivoli, just like everywhere else." One of the youth who had described his experiences in the film stood and sincerely thanked everyone for coming, especially all the uptown people. And he said he never would have thought so many people cared about what happened to him. And a longtime community activist responded gently, "I think another way to ask that question is to wonder what Jamaica has learned from the incursion." These audience members were modeling a kind of restorative justice practice that is oriented toward the generation of safety and accountability. By disturbing the normative frames through which crime and violence have been represented in Jamaica, and by offering an alternative to the policy-driven approaches that normally constitute intervention, we've been seeking to understand the potential impact of alternative research practices on different sectors of the national community, and thus to limb an alternative route through which meaningful social transformation could occur. And at the center of such a transformation is the question of safety. Safety, in this case, would be a gloss for a life outside of the cyclical quotidianity of forms of violence that nonetheless comprise complex relations of scale outside of racialized geographies of dispossession. It would signify a life in which opportunities and possibilities are available without a quid pro quo. But if when people want safety, what they end up getting is security, which I will define as the protection of a liberal post-coloniality that nevertheless sanctions whiteness, class hierarchy, and heteropatriarchy through military and police responses like states of emergency, then we need to look beyond the state for the cultivation of a different kind of accountability. So security is imagined and enacted transnationally and globally, but it is nevertheless authorized through and in the name of the state. But safety is grounded locally and requires the intimacy of trusting relationships. So in other words, to feel safe, there has to be accountability, and accountability context of a loving relationship. So there are local models for this, and these are models that include the practice of reasoning amongst Rastafari, the community-based problem solving of artistic groups like the Sistren Theatre Collective, or other groups like the Peace Management Initiative or the Violent Prevention Alliance. Right? These kinds of practices do not replicate the colonial love of governance, regulation, and tutelage, but instead seek to generate mature, responsible love, love with accountability, as Aisha Shahida Simmons has termed it. And these are the kinds of conversations that we've attempted to provoke with our work, to provoke by putting different kinds of archives in juxtaposition with each other. And ultimately, I believe these conversations can give us a sense of how, when, and why embodied freedom can actually counteract the constraints of historical violence in the present, can help create the conditions of responsibility and real love, and can urge us to work through the complex entanglements of accountability in order to act reparatively in concert as humans. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and show you the 7.5 minute short.
In my small time, I don't know much.
I went to
When
high school.
don't they the children already, the brothers of a one feel like might be little good in session now, but it's a little bit more. You know, I don't know about them always, when I come and say, like them must know, even though we really stay here, so we must go up to the building and place.
CD, I had a CD store and a CD shop. I had a CD stand and a CD shop.
Any need for all that aggression?
I don't know why they never normally come around videos. So never have a problem with it.
You want to make a mic here then?
But go on back and come there.
Back the mic here and come.
Back and forward. We'll wait for you.
So I was growing up. I live at the first. I was growing up at because I did
when you black, favorite thing, football and
the impression of the black. When they came to the body, it was quiet.
they were away with the farm.
Okay, Deborah, thank you so much for that presentation and for talking about your work and sort of contextualizing so many of the issues that come up in this book that I sort of really enjoyed reading despite the sort of difficult subject matter in many ways, political life in the wake of the plantation, and for showing us film, which I think really goes some way to responding to the first question that I really wanted to ask and use as an opportunity to connect it to the broader aims of Daniela's research project. I wanted to ask you a question about how you feel your work in this particular book and in the film that you're making engages with this question or engages with this idea that is brought forward in Daniela's work about archival encounters. And I was specifically interested in thinking about that with regard to the role of ethnography within it. One of the things that Daniela has sort of mapped out on the website is thinking about sort of suggesting that archival encounters, or the aim of the project, is in one way of trying to generate other possibilities of knowing and dealing with the limitations of the archive and generating other modalities of knowing. And that seems really central to your project as well when you talk about curating archives of effect. So I wondered if you could sort of respond to that particular idea of archival encounters and how you see your work as dealing with this kind of political effects of digitizing archives, if you see it responding to that element of the project as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as many people have written, the problem of the colonial archive, as you know, is that it's saturated with violence. And in order to appear in the archive, already a violence has been done, right? So, I guess one might say that the beauty of ethnography is that you are in this privileged position to be able to generate and cultivate other kinds of archives, right, through working collaboratively with people in a range of settings. But you also, and that's sort of the interviewing we did to have people talk about what their experiences were during the state of emergency. At the time when we started, there hadn't been a commission of inquiry established as yet. There hadn't been a list of the dead released. So we felt that it was necessary to generate an archive of experience in that way in order to, remind people across the society that this is still going on. This is still affecting people who live in the community and, of course, beyond. And if we think about being in the same national space, in the same community, it means that we all have a hand in it, and we all have played a role in maintaining these kinds of political divisions and these ideas about whose life has value, So on the one hand, that's, a way to generate new kinds of archives through embodied participatory collaboration, really. Of course, there are other embodied archives that emerged that we also incorporated into the exhibit. And those have to do with some of the religious and dance and music practices that sort of were forged in the crucible of West Kingston as people migrated from the countryside to the city. So revival is one of those practices, but Kumina also is, and Rastafari, the Nydia A drumming also is, because West Kingston was also a center of Rastafari after the 30s, 40s, right? But the other interesting thing, I think, for us is that in the process of stringing the various archives we were working with together for people, and Matt Schwartz had sent me the drone footage that he received as a result of a Freedom of Information request from the US drone that was overhead during the Tivoli incursion. We would put different things together and come back to community members to show them and ask, you know, is this kind of organization okay with you? Do you like the direction this is going? Do you still feel comfortable saying what you said? You know, is that still an okay thing to be public about? And for many of them, it was the first time, really for all of them, it was the first time seeing the drone footage. You know, so it was the first time that they were kind of getting the bird's eye view of what was happening to their community as they were experiencing it sort of under somebody's dining room table or huddled behind somebody's refrigerator in the kitchen. You know, so it was really, you know, they were very attentive to what was happening in that footage, watching the soldiers, watching people running, you know, saying things like, oh, you caught something there, or, you know, they would see things happening that some of the people who provided testimony during the commission inquiry that ultimately was established had said had happened that lawyers had tried to squelch. So, you know, we often think about drone footage and surveillance footage as an imposing violence, of course, again, and it is in many ways. But at the same time, they saw in it something that validated what they had told to authorities that was being dismissed. So it was interesting to kind of develop a new perspective on that particular kind of colonial or continued imperial archive that sort of disturbs those normative equations that we make between surveillance footage and insecurity. You know, they were seeing in this a moment of recognition, actually.
Thank you so much for that response, Deborah. And actually, it sort of connects to another question that came up for me while you were doing the presentation, which isn't something that I said to you in advance, so I'm just going to ask anyways, and I think we could probably still run with it. But there was something about the way you talked about generating affective engagements through the editing process. And I imagine that to be the process of making the film. And it seems to me that that's what you're talking about just now here, where you're talking about the way in which you related to the people who participated in the kind of ethnographic part of the project, or the ethnographic part of archiving, creating these archives of effect, that it seems like that perhaps it was the relationship with the community that is a part of this generating an effective engagement with the archive or with the material. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, it is partly that, but it's also thinking about the audience. I mean, I think that audience so much picks its form in a way. So if you can identify the audience for something, then that goes a long way in telling you how to organize the something, you know. So, you know, once we asked people in the community who they thought the audience should be, and once we ourselves also, you know, thought with that, there were decisions that we made that would only be provocative or affecting to those audiences, you know. So some of that is the way we pan on a certain building, for example. So, you know, people would know that if they see the building that says Java, you know, in one shot, that's Dodas's headquarters. And then if you're panning from that building and you see the building that's blue on the bottom and white on the top, that's a police station. And there never had been a police station in the community of Tivoli Gardens. And Jamaicans know that. You know, that has always been part of the problem, is that this community has existed outside of the normative realms of governance in Kingston and beyond. So to move from a shot of Java, Dodas's headquarters, to the newly constructed police post is to show a transition in authority, or at least an aspirational transition in authority for the community as a whole. And then there are other kinds of decisions, like leaving the resolution of a story unsaid, staying maybe a little longer than would be comfortable on a person's teary face, allowing the contradiction between what's the words somebody is saying and the affect that they're representing through by their face and by their embodiment to just remain as a contradiction, and also to not have any kind of overarching narrator who would authorize the stories or authorize the kind of history in which the narratives sit. Those are all sort of decisions that we made that would produce, that we hope anyway, would produce a particular kind of affective engagement that, you know, that would do one and hopefully two things. One is that it would create the conditions for viewers, ostensibly either other downtown Kingston dwellers or other residents of Kingston generally who also have these kinds of experiences, to recognize themselves in it, but also for more middle class or upper class Jamaicans to be able to see and hear these individuals as human, you know, as, you know, so many people don't. They think they're always already criminals living in a garrison community, living downtown. They must be part of it. They must be involved, right? And so I think on the first level, it is to try to create the conditions for people to be able to see and understand garrison dwellers as the same kind of human that they are. And then if they can take that next step and see where they have also participated in the forms of violence people are talking about, then that's sort of the added plus. Like, does it turn the lens back on themselves and back on our own complicity in maintaining these structures?
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. It really does give me a really clear sense of what you mean when you're talking about curating archives of effect and thinking about the role of effect in your kind of broader research process. And one of the things I was really curious to think through a little bit more, or maybe talking about in relation to this idea of juxtaposing and assembling different types of archives, is how you talk about archives of effect as being different from counter archives. And I wanted to talk a little bit in particular where you talk about juxtaposing visual, oral, historical, colonial, and post-colonial. And I wondered if you could talk about that, the coming together of that, and why that is significantly for you an archive of effect as opposed to a counter archive. And I think, and how you feel that that gives us a sense of what sovereignty feels like. And perhaps one of the reasons why I was interested in that question is in relation to my own work. In reading the book, it made me realize that, oh, a part of what I've been doing with my research is creating an idea of what diaspora feels like. And I only thought of that in relation to the way in which you were talking about juxtaposing these different archives and seeing it pulled out in the text itself. So being one moment in the kind of ethnographic moment and being in the field with you, and then being back in the kind of historical moment and in a piece that I know you might have pulled out of an archive in order to contextualize that ethnographic bit as well. And it very much is relevant to the work I did around questions of diaspora in a kind of British context in my ethnographic work around Black feminism in Britain, and the way in which I was talking about Black feminist ethnography as a kind of Black feminist archival practice, in a way in which I now see as kind of creating an archive of effect around this idea of diaspora and what it feels like. So could you speak to that a little bit about why this is an archive of effect as opposed to a counter archive, which gave me also a new way of thinking about my work, not as a counter archive, but something else.
Yeah, sure. And, you know, this is in some ways provisional, but I guess I would argue that generating an archive that is affective would be a feminist praxis. You know, I think that we often when people are talking about counter archives, it's that they're looking for moments of resistance, seeds of a revolution, overthrowing the plantation owner, the imperial master, the colonial state, whatever it is. And there's a certain teleology to it that suggests that we need to find those moments of resistance because, and this is, that is an important practice. I'm sorry for the sirens in the background. That is an important practice because, there has also been scholarship, older scholarship, that suggested that we didn't resist, that we haven't forged these kinds of counter narratives of what society should be like, which is not true. So it is important to point those out. But I think in doing so, we're constantly looking for a kind of vanguard, a revolutionary vanguard. We're looking for a narrative that's about seizing the state in one way or another, right? Remaking authority from the top down by toppling the top, And for me, I think, the process and practice of liberation is actually much more provisional, much more open-ended, in many ways more internal. Like when you speak with people or you yourself experience profound transformations in consciousness, you feel it from them, emanating from them. You feel it within yourself, and even if the external world does not appreciably change, you've had a change inside yourself, and you transmit that change to others in the world. And that's not something you can hold on to. You can't point that out and put it in a card catalog in an archive. You feel it, it's transmitted through this kind of haptic realm. And I think looking for that, getting at that, seeing where people are refusing, to use another Black transnational feminist term, refusing the terms of the human into which they're slotted, right? That is, in fact, a kind of feminist praxis of archive building that doesn't necessarily lead to a totalizing project of some kind of overthrow, but can lead to these moments of liberation, these moments of freedom, and these moments of connection, between people across time and space, really, in diaspora, across diasporic space as well.
Thank you so much for those comments as well. And I think that gives me a kind of segue into talking a little bit more about my work, but also sharing this film the video collage that I wanted to share. And particularly, it's the point that you raised about the profound transformations in consciousness. I mean, I think that's relevant to the way in which I was engaging ethnography as a Black feminist archival practice in my PhD. I was really looking at the process of naming and the changing configurations around the identity Blackness in the British context, which has at times been more expansive and more limiting. So I was really using ethnography to track these sort of changes and create an archive around that and connect it to past forms of struggle. But I think in the present, my current work has really been trying to grapple with a kind of sense of a profound transformation in my own consciousness that has happened as a result of doing a kind of archival research and through my kind of ethnographic research process that begins as an MA student working on archives around Amy Ashwood Garvey and continues on into my sort of PhD research around Black feminism in Britain. And now really trying to connect the research I've done in archives much more to sort of family histories and family landscapes and deal with the kind of lack of family archives in many ways. I had an aunt pass away a couple of years ago, and she'd always promised me that all of these family photographs and histories were going to be mine. Unfortunately, when she passed away, I don't know what happened to that stuff. So I was like, how do I tell these stories? I have to find another way. And then I went to Jamaica recently to access material I thought was going to be in an archive. That archive has moved. So again, it was like, how do I tell these stories and make the use of this trip and tell something out of it? And so I think this video collage that I've literally created as a part of a response and engagement with your work is my attempt at least dealing with the loss of that particular moment of these two different stories that I wasn't able to get that material, but try to tell it another way, using the visual in particular, because in the context of the last few months, I just haven't had the headspace to write, but I need to still produce and work, and I have a desire for that. So the visual as another way of articulating knowledge has been really important for me in this time. So I wanted to share that now, if you don't mind. Just have to get it up here. Is it showing?
It is.
Great.
So good to you know.
I love it. I love the editing of the text, the reworking of the text. I love the juxtaposition of the photographs, both archival and family. That was great, really wonderful.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. What I'm trying to do with the text and like the kind of crossing out and stuff is play around with the idea of the politics of citation, and in a way of like, if I'm doing this visual work, I want you to see what is informing my thinking. And of course, similarly, we have a sort of shared relationship to Zora Neale Hurston, which you talk about in Political Life as well. So I wanted to bring that into the conversation. I'm not sure we have enough time for the last question I wanted to ask, but if we don't, we can leave it here. But if you have a couple of minutes, I think I particularly,
yeah.
Okay, great. I think as a final question, I think I particularly wanted to ask you a question about the relationship between the perpetuation of sovereign violence and repair. And this is taking us in a slightly different direction than the conversations we've had just now. But it feels particularly important because we're coming sort of out of this recent election in the United States. We're coming out of a kind of context where sovereignty is fundamentally connected to violence in the United States, as it always has been, and it's rooted in the kind of plantation economy that exists in the US. And I wanted to sort of ask you a question, or put back on you the question that you raise in the coda of your book, where you say, how might we think of repair effectively without evacuating the possibility of politics? And I've been thinking about that a lot, about the kind of the contradiction of being really excited that Trump didn't win. But then also, what does it mean to celebrate Biden and Kamala Harris, who are very much embedded in some of these very same violences around sovereignty? So I just wanted to sort of bring that to you, what you think with that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think what I want to signal is that it's not a zero-sum game. You know, within this context, in this world, who controls the state really matters. And I think that, you know, that has become abundantly clear in the United States, in the UK, in Brazil, in India, in many other places around the world over the last, well, especially over the last 4 years. But I still want to hold out for seeking practices of accountability that extend beyond the state, and that also are, you know, that are both macro state and more micro, you know. And so to think of the process of repair as a process that must happen at the very local level, interpersonally, but also that must happen, you know, above the level of the state. So what kind of politics is being generated? Can we continue to generate? Can we imagine a new that does not rely on traditional state forms, but that can produce a safer relationship to a governance structure? That's still an important question. And of course, you know, historically, people have imagined that in many different kinds of ways, whether that's a, you know, Pan-African organization, it's Garveyism, it's the various forms of internationalism that thrived in the earlier part of the 20th century, it's the non-aligned movement, you know, it's the AU, for example, now, or the EU now. All of them are complicated, of course, and have their own sets of issues, problems, but, you know, they're seeking to create some kind of political community that extends beyond the boundaries of the nation state. And, you know, if we look at some of those and then also really are attuned to the forms of political engagement people enact sort of below the level of the state to improve their communities, to generate positive outcomes for their children, for example, those also can be modeled at these, you know, more abstracted levels of community building, of which the nation state is one, right? So I think it's to sort of tack between those two forms of organization that, you know, are still important, you know, in the world in which we actually exist, while maintaining a vision for a world that's better than the one that we're living in.
Thank you. So maybe potentially connected to some of the discussions that's happening around abolitionist movements, whereby it's like imagining new ways of attending and relating with each other that don't rely on the carceral state and don't rely on the prison industrial complex, or don't rely on police officers in the traditional way, but trying to imagine something else where community forms of care are centered at the way in which we relate to each other.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that and ending on those points. I really appreciate you sharing your work with us today, giving this much time and engaging with my questions and my work. So thank you so much.
And thank you for sharing the work. And I love the sort of dialogue that it creates. It's really provocative and beautiful.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you to both of you for the generosity of your thinking and the sort of the generative encounter between your two practices. This was really great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I can't wait.
Thank you, Danielle, for the invitation. Thank you for the invitation. As you know, when I saw that you invited me to be in conversation with Deborah, I was like, best thing ever. So
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's great.
bye. Take care.